I want to come to the current moment quickly in this event, but I also want to talk about what we just saw. Joel, this started with you. I don't know, going back to what year. You were a Knight Fellow, and you produced a report documenting hundreds of these kinds of attacks on journalists. I'm curious to hear how that all started and how you hooked up with Max.
So thanks so much, Simon. Well, for many years, I ran an organization called the Committee to Protect Journalists, and it's an organization that defends the rights of journalists around the world whenever they face attacks or censorship or violence, and I traveled around the world to do this job. And then after 15 years as executive director, I decided it was time to do something new, and I joined the Knight Institute as a fellow, and the executive director of the Knight Institute, who's named Jamil Jaffer, said, well, you're going to be a fellow here. What do you want to look at? He said, we're a U.S., it has to be something domestically focused. That hadn't been my remit, if you will. And we had created this database when I was at the Committee to Protect Journalists, along with other organizations, called the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. And one of the data points that emerged from this collection of data was some of the statistics you saw cited in this documentary. This was right after 2020 and the social justice protests and the murder of George Floyd. 129 journalists arrested, hundreds beaten and attacked, 80% of them by police while covering these protests across the United States. I thought this was a press freedom crisis that had gone unnoticed. And so I said to Jamil, hey, I want to do a report about this. And it was actually his idea. He said, this sounds like an interesting report and something we need to do. Maybe we should do a documentary as well. That wasn't my idea. And maybe Max, you could pick it up from there, because it was the Knight Institute that found you.
Yeah,
Great choice, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah, so the report that Joel did is phenomenally in-depth, phenomenally thorough, and it was kind of the source material for the film. And I think what the Knight Institute recognized very astutely is that a lot of what was happening was very visceral. You're maybe feeling that still from watching the film. And so it was, how do we use the medium of film to kind of elevate a lot of the work Joel had already done and kind of make people understand what journalists are going through by actually bringing their imagery to the forefront in a film and then hearing from them. So it was kind of a companion piece to a lot of the legwork that Joel had already done.
Ashanti Blaize-Hopkins, you were at the Society for the Protection of Journalists at the time of these protests. What were you seeing? What was the state of the industry at the time when all this was going down?
So it was interesting. At the exact time where the officer that murdered George Floyd was going on trial in Los Angeles, we had already started to see a lot of journalists being targeted, being arrested for other protests that were happening in Southern California that weren't even related to that particular case. And so at the time, I was the vice president of the LA chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. And our board was very concerned about the outcome of the murder case for George Floyd, because we thought that if this officer is found not guilty, we are going to have protests. And if we're going to have protests, there are going to be more journalists who are going to be targeted, who are going to be detained, and who are going to be injured. And so for us, it was, there has to be something that we can do. And so we ended up pulling together a coalition of journalism organizations, media unions, First Amendment advocacy groups throughout the state of California to figure out, how do we try to, in some small way, combat what we think might happen, right? So we started meeting with the chief of police of LA, and really got our butts handed to us the first time we met with him, because we were not prepared. This is not what journalists do. Like, we don't advocate for ourselves. We don't go in meetings and try and change policy and change systems that are in place. That's not what we do. We cover stories. You know, we are the first draft of history. That's what we do. But we slowly and, well, really quickly understood that we had to organize. We had to do things differently, and we had to approach legislation And so that coalition ended up getting a Senate Bill 98 passed through the state legislature that actually increased press freedoms in the state of California for journalists who were covering situations of civil unrest. But it didn't stop there. We got the governor to sign this bill. I remember the day it was signed, we were all like, what did we just do? How did we make this happen? We're like a rag team group of journalists, right? They're doing guerrilla war, tactics to try and get this stuff across the finish line. But the real work came with the implementation. Because it's one thing to get a law passed. It's another thing to have police officers actually follow the law. And when you're the law, who's policing you? And
I want to ask about that because there was one former police officer, I believe, Mike Parker was his name, amid many protesters, many journalists who spoke to you. That was a challenge for you, Joel, was trying to you wanted to get the perspective of the police to hear whether or not they were distinguishing between protesters and journalists and why not. But you encountered a huge challenge doing that.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because when I was trying to do the report, the kind of mistrust that plays out in the streets that fuels this dynamic was played out also in the context of my reporting. I mean, it was just really, really difficult, and then maybe there's some police reporters in this room who experience this every day, just to get police to talk to me. They would talk to me on background. They would be willing to, but I couldn't. They wouldn't allow themselves to be quoted because they weren't official spokespeople. I got a lot. I really made a huge effort to go through court transcripts where police had to testify, and they would share their perspective because I wanted to understand it. And then through one of the other people who's featured in the film, Mickey Osterreicher, who's a lawyer, he works with photographers, and he actually knew Mike Parker, who's a former LA sheriff. He was part of the sheriff's department in LA, and he's actually, I give him a lot of credit because he was willing to speak publicly. Obviously, I don't agree with what he had to say, but as a journalist, I want to hear that perspective. I really value and appreciate the opportunity to hear from people who have a perspective that's different from mine. So I'm really glad that he was willing to sit down and share his perspective as part of the film. I think it made it more interesting. I think it allowed us to it made it richer and deeper, and that is really, my goal as a journalist as well.
Amen to that. We have a question from Slido. So somebody, and this comes up in my line of work, being a reporter here in Boston and covering protests and any matter of issues. But the questioner asked, police will try to interfere with on-scene news gathering, using, there's this kettle technique where they sort of corral protesters and journalists for hours on end. And according to the Slido question, editors often say to comply with that. Oftentimes you don't have any other option but to comply. Is there another option? What would you say, Ashanti? How do you respond in a situation like that?
So I would say this: one, it's systemic. This is in many ways, at least our experience with engaging with LAPD. We were able to get all of their training materials, and there was one section of their training that said police versus media. And I was like, oh, if you're framing it that way, well, yeah, then we're going to have situations where police on the ground are thinking, I'm against the people here who were trying to collect information, right? So I can understand the thinking of, look, just comply so we can still get the story. Because that is our job as journalists. If you get detained, we're still not getting the story. If you get arrested, we're not getting the story. So we'll work it out on the back end in the courts. So I can totally understand that approach, because nobody wants to go out as a journalist and be detained and be arrested and be targeted. We're human beings. And I think sometimes people forget that journalists are human beings.
Was that also part of the legislation in SB 98 in trying to make it known that journalists can be in certain areas and that they do? It was trying to fortify their rights and actually put that into legislation. That was, unfortunately, we weren't able to fit SB 98 into the film, but it's kind of become a model for other states to really further enshrine journalists' rights.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a couple things about kettling. First of all, so just for people who are not familiar with kettling, this is a technique that was really developed about 15 years ago in which police totally surround people who are engaged in demonstrations and just they keep them, constrain them sometimes for hours, and then arrest everyone without distinction. A lot of lawyers I talk to and constitutional experts believe that it's unconstitutional. That's certainly widely viewed. And one of the characters in this film, Alexei Wood, he was kettled. And if you are in and what's interesting about that is, I had this in the report, other journalists who looked a little different from him were able to leave the kettle. The police were like, okay, you look like a journalist, you can leave. They didn't think he looked like a journalist because he does journalism in a different way. And he was detained along with all the other protesters and arrested and, as you saw, prosecuted. But the one thing I will say about kettling, because it's a really, and if you're in the kettle, by the way, and the police are arresting everyone and you're a journalist and they decide they're going to arrest you, it doesn't matter what your editor said, you're going to be arrested. But in New York, in New York City, there was actually an agreement that came out of some of these demonstrations, and the police agreed that they were going to stop using kettling. So we'll see if there's compliance with that agreement. So, but in New York City, it's now a tactic that the police have agreed as part of a settlement which came out of these the protests, the 2020 protests, that they're not going to use it anymore.
This is SB 98 that you're referring to?
Yeah.
That's
in
the California law,
Okay.
but there's a separate settlement in New York. There was a lot of settlements. There was settlements in Minneapolis, settlements in New York. We have this new Senate bill in California. So there were some positive reforms that came out of all of this.
So we talked yesterday about what's happening now. This was several years ago. We're in quite a moment as a country in terms of press freedom. So just this week, the head of NPR and the head of PBS were brought before Congress in this hearing titled "Anti-American Airwaves," and are seeing our federal funding being cut. There's been a number of initiatives from the White House in the short time that Donald Trump has been back in office. The banning of the Associated Press from White House briefings over the refusal to say Gulf of America. And I could go on about this, but how does this connect? Everything that you've been reporting and everything that was in this documentary, how does it connect with the current moment?
I mean, I think they're all. Joel just published a piece for Vanity Fair, and it kind of looked at a democracy's slide into an authoritarian regime, right? And one of the maybe canaries in a coal mine is attacks on freedom of the press. And this is one sliver of that, right? Which is journalists covering protests in the United States and then the ability of protesters to get their message out. And I think what you're seeing now is an expanded attack on journalists and journalism in all these different places, right? And it's like, what is the end goal of that? It's to change the narrative, it's to take over the narrative, and it's to distort the reality. And then if you've got a distorted reality, as a citizenry, we cannot make informed decisions that are in our best interest, right? And that's the importance of journalism, right? So if you start to attack it at all the different points, as the administration is doing, we can't make decisions based on reality and facts.
The title of your film is Flashpoint, but one of the original possibilities was the chilling effect, right? How did you arrive at that decision to call it Flashpoint and not the chilling effect?
Great. There was a lot of debate over that.
I don't think I was a part of it, was I? I don't think I was in the room for that debate. But
there was a lot of debate, right? Because I think, and this was a conversation with Knight, which was, the chilling effect is a very broad term, which basically, right, is things start happening, and I think you spoke to it, Ashanti, which is people don't want to go out and protest. They don't want to report on protests. They don't want to speak up, and it starts to kind of spread, and everyone starts to get quiet, and that's how you lean into or get into an authoritarian regime. And then I think when we thought about it, we were like, But these feel like moments that are happening and they kind of flash up, right? And Joel's talked a lot about how this is a very periodic thing, right? Over time, there's these moments where it's, oil in the frying pan. And I think we kind of leaned more into that as kind of these like hot moments that over time build up and get bigger and bigger and bigger.
And you can never predict when it's going to happen. We didn't see the Black Lives Matter protests coming. There could be protests soon. There are protests happening now.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I want to also sort of get back to your broader point. I mean, I think what or your broader question about how that moment in 2020 connects to the current one, obviously from the broader context in which the attacks on press freedom are happening now is much scarier because they're orchestrated, they're part of a political project, they're connected to attacks on other institutions of democratic life. And that is why this, the press in that moment has an absolutely critical function because it's a check on power and it's independent. But I also think that there's something that's been happening over a much longer period of time, which really, you could certainly trace it back to the Obama administration, which is the declining power of the media as an institution. And that is part of the dynamic that we saw in 2020. I mean, it used to be that police, there have always been outbursts and attacks against the media when there are demonstrations. Certainly, it's documented in this film going back to the civil rights movement. But there's also a dynamic in which the police maybe didn't want that kind of bad publicity. That was really what kept journalists safe. It was ugly. It made them look bad. They didn't really want those images all over the place. In 2020, they didn't care. They just didn't care. They just didn't perceive the damage that can be done by antagonizing and being hostile towards the press as detrimental to their position as law enforcement. And now take that and elevate that to the president.
Joel,
He's not afraid of the press.
You published a piece for everybody who hasn't read in Vanity Fair what Joel Simon published yesterday. It was alarming. I mean, it's about there was a report that you cited looking at the countries of the world and the move towards authoritarianism, that the majority of people on Earth and the majority of countries on Earth live under authoritarian to different degrees. The United States, I believe, is still considered a liberal democracy at this point. But you illustrate how attacks on the press are the first thing to happen in an authoritarian tendency. Why did you write that piece?
Well, there's this report it's published every year by a research institute. It's actually based in Sweden. It's called VDEM, and it's considered kind of the gold standard in terms of the data set, the data that's used to analyze, the state of democracy around the world. And I looked at the report, and first of all, for the first time in 20 years, there are more autocracies than democracies. 91 autocracies, 88 democracies. And the data shows that yes, the first target is the media when countries sort of start declining in terms of their democratic standing. And there's some really alarming findings in the report, and if you put them into the current moment, which is that there's generally, once you start this slide into there's democratic backsliding, you generally have a period of 3 to 5 years to turn it around. And there are no instances in which it's been turned around after 10 years. So I found that very shocking and alarming. And I also am very concerned, as someone who spent my life and career defending the rights of journalists, of the correlation between the escalating attacks on the media and journalists and the correlation around the world with autocratization.
Can I also add to...
Yeah, go for it.
That journalists at this moment in time are being attacked from several different sides, right? It's not just the administration at the White House. It's not just law enforcement. It's also citizens, right? So I know colleagues who go to these protests, and sometimes they don't want to show that they're press because they are often targeted by some of the attendees of the protests, right? So now you are having to safeguard yourself from all of these different areas. But I also think it's really important to note, I think that there is a misconception that, oh, we have to get ready to fight this. We're already in the fight. We're already in the fight, right? The war is happening now, and it's not, we don't have time to get ready to try and fight back against this. If we're not already ready, we're going to lose the war. The war's now. And so I think it's really important to kind of emphasize that journalists now don't have the luxury to just be journalists anymore. We have to be advocates, because if we don't fight for this industry, if we don't fight for journalism, if we don't fight to maintain the fourth estate, we won't have it, and Superman isn't coming.
That's a big statement from what we learn in journalism school, that advocates are one thing and journalists are the other. And now it seems like that line is being blurred. It's being blurred in the protests, and it makes me wonder. Joel Simon, do you agree with that statement?
I'm a press freedom advocate. I've spent my life as a journalist and defending the rights of journalists. So here's where I agree. I think journalists, in order to do your job, and in so many parts of the world, you have to be prepared to defend your own rights. I think that journalists have to advocate for their own rights. If you are a news organization, you have to defend the physical integrity of your people, and you have to fight to do your job. Though that's the area where I don't consider that activism. I consider those activities essential to the exercise of journalism. I do think there's lots of journalism that I respect that kind of straddles the line between journalism. But I actually think the way that journalists right now in this moment, the most important thing we can do to serve democracy and protect democracy is do our jobs. But doing our job means we have to actively defend our rights. We have to fight to make sure that we're safely able to do the work that matters, and we have to report with independence and without fear. We have to fight for that.
Mitch Zuckoff, when you were up here, you made quite a statement. I don't know if that landed. I think it did, because there was some clapping. But you said the only thing that's going to save our democracy is what we're doing as journalists, which connects me with that idea that journalism is the first thing that's attacked in an authoritarian situation. Somebody on Slido asked if there's any examples of a country, or perhaps even here, where there's enough pushback to turn the tide against the kind of tendencies we're seeing. Can you think of any examples of that?
Brazil. Yeah, there are many examples in the research that, this could be, where democratic institutions came under attack and the forces of democracy resisted. And journalism is absolutely critical because of its independence. And because, they're going after, the funding for NPR, for some of you may have heard Voice of America, and they're obviously going after funding for universities. But, journalism in this country, thankfully, is not funded by government. And so it has more opportunities to resist. Some of the things that are happening are alarming. I think that there is some media that are not fighting the way that they should fight. But as an independent institution, journalism plays a unique role. And so I totally agree with Mitch. I totally agree that what happens in terms of the preservation of democracy will depend on, in good measure, much more than we realize, because everyone likes to disparage journalists and everyone thinks, our role is diminished. But it will depend in good measure on whether journalists are able to continue to do their job.
I get texts from people all the time. Why isn't the media covering this? And it's like they're just as mad at us as they are at anybody else, any other actor. Somebody from the audience asks, how are international journalists in the United States supposed to protect themselves while doing their job with limited rights in the United States, as we're seeing every day now? Who wants to take that on?
I know everyone's like, Joe?
Will wearing a press badge, will that protect folks?
I mean, look. I think I'm working with so at the Newmark School, the journalism school. Is there a Newmark School alum here?
CUNY Systems,
Yes,
straight from Brooklyn.
Yeah, CUNY. I've been working with news organizations across the country, and one of the big concerns they have is the immigration status of their journalists, the people they employ. They're very worried. I mean, one of the things in the film is you see, when journalists come into contact with law enforcement, they can be arrested. So if you are a journalist and you have a green card or you have some other status that you're not a citizen, that can have huge consequences. There's a lot of concern about that. I think it's going to be much harder. It's just harder for people to get visas to come to the United States and work, so it may well become more difficult for, there's a significant and important cadre of international media that covers the U.S. that plays an important role. They may find it more difficult depending on the country that they're coming from, but journalists are definitely impacted by the kind of not just the hostility towards immigrants. It makes it difficult for journalists to cover those communities as well because they're so vulnerable. Some of the sources that journalists have traditionally had when they cover immigrant communities, they're not willing to speak with them. They're concerned about their own status. So it's a really complicated moment.
I think it's also an issue for international students that come to the United States who end up being journalists at their higher education institutions. And I just want to make clear, I did not say student journalists for a reason. These are journalists. They're in the trenches with professional journalists. I know I myself used to be the faculty advisor for the student newspaper at my institution. And when we had some of the protests that popped up around the country for the situation that was happening over in Palestine and Israel, I had students that were international students. The editor-in-chief of the paper at the time was an international student, and she was at USC. It had been shut down, and the police were closing in. And I said, you have to get out of there. You will lose your status. I understand that you want to get this story, but nothing is more important than your future, right? And so those are also the situations that we're looking at. We have these international students that are coming to the United States to learn about journalism because we do it better than most. And they're learning how to do that so they can bring it back to the communities that they come from. But I think now that's in jeopardy.
And I think to add to that too, right? You talk about, journalists representing communities that they come from or being able to go to communities where they're representative, right? And so not just international journalists, but, and we talked about this in the film, you don't want to have just a room full of white journalists, right? You want to make sure that every representation matters in journalism, right? So whether it's an international student coming in that is a journalist or whether it is someone else that's trying to represent a community or explore an issue that's not being covered in quote unquote the mainstream, those voices really matter. And I think it's important to kind of remember that with who's telling the stories as well. And I think that's just an expansion on the international journalists that are coming here to study.
And that actually goes to the next Slido question that I have here, which is that people from marginalized communities often no longer feel that the press are watchdogs in their communities or feel harmed or exploited by past actions from the media. How would you say the media can rebuild that trust or build it in the first place?
They have to talk to the community. They have to humbly go to communities that they cover, especially marginalized communities, especially minoritized communities, and humbly listen to what they want and need, and then, have to act in kind, right? Most communities know exactly how they want to engage with the news that they are getting. Most communities know what they want covered out of their communities. But if you don't have journalists in those communities talking to these people on a regular basis, not just when there's a story, but on a regular basis to understand who's in the community, to understand what their needs are, well, then you're not going to get that. That community engagement piece is essential. Yeah. It's essential.
And I think, and I don't know if this is a trend, I want to believe it's a trend, but I'm hearing more about kind of this resurgence of local grassroots newsrooms, right? So as people look at the Washington Post, right, and the control that Jeff Bezos has there and how the opinion column has shifted, right? And that pissed off a lot of journalists, right, that are in a traditional institution outlet. And I think journalists are trying to figure out how to gain kind of that control back. And I think you're seeing this exciting growth of smaller worker-owned, so journalist-owned newsrooms. Many of them are nonprofit, popping up in communities that, whether it's a larger city like LA or New York, you've got the Southlander that's starting up in LA, Hellgate in New York, that's worker-led. There's other ones like 100 Days in Appalachia. And so
New Bedford Light here in New Bedford, Massachusetts. We have somebody in the audience who
yeah, and it's like if you've got people that actually are in and care about those communities, they're going to be better represented in the storytelling.
Yeah, and making sure that your newsroom reflects the communities that you cover, right? So if I am covering communities that are mostly Black and brown, I should not have a newsroom that is filled with people who are not Black and brown. What are we doing? It's 2025, right? So I think it's that too. There has to be a change in culture when it comes to even how these newsrooms are led and how the structures are put in place.
Yeah, and the thing that, I want to go back to something that Mitch said. I think one of the things that when I was at the Committee to Protect Journalists and a journalist came under threat, I would often go to the country. I wouldn't know the media that well in the country, but I get to know them because I would be involved in supporting them. And that's kind of happening in the United States right now. I wasn't deeply familiar with local media that had developed over the last 10 years because it wasn't on my radar in the way it is now. And I'm going to go back to, again, what Mitch said when he introduced this film. Journalism is being reborn across this country. It's actually kind of exciting. There's a kind of, there's a media that served its role that's kind of dying off, and in some ways that is really sad to see. But there's also like a new form of journalism that's being reborn, and we're not paying that much attention to it because there's so much other things. There's so much else happening. But there's a future of journalism that's really worth fighting for, and we have to fight for it.
And just to add to that, I think the film's pretty doom and gloom, right? Like it's intense, and I think it can leave you feeling pretty hopeless. But I will add to kind of what Joel's saying here is there's student journalists in this room, and we were talking to some earlier in the conference, and this film has screened at journalism schools around the country. And there's hope there, and like maybe our generation of storytellers isn't going to figure out what the next version of journalism looks like, and it's continually evolving. But I want to believe, I think we have to believe that, the young storytellers in this room are going to figure it out, So
I gave a keynote speech just last fall to the Associated Collegiate Press and the Journalism Association of Community Colleges annual convention. And it was a room of about 1,000 journalists at higher education institutions from across this country, from four-year institutions, from two-year institutions. And the topic of my keynote was the fourth estate is now. Because for all of them it is, right? We have a thing called news deserts. And in many cases, higher education news media outlets are the only news media outlets within a 10 to 20 mile radius. And so giving that speech to that room and having those students come up to me afterwards and hearing the fire in their bellies and hearing the excitement and hearing the resolve and hearing the I'm ready to fight was so inspirational, right? And it made me feel so much better about the future of this industry because you have a generation of students who know what they're getting into. They see it. This is all they've ever known about the journalism industry is the fight. And they're still ready and willing to fill a room to talk about what's next.
And kudos to Mitch, Sarah, and Amy, because this conference is part of that, right? It's bringing together this energy and these ideas to try and continue evolving this craft, and because it is so important to democracy.
I want to ask a question that I'm actually asking myself today as a reporter, because there's been such a rush of news. It's one of my colleagues said it's like a constant shit hose. Every day there's something new. And as a radio reporter, it takes me a couple days to put together, a radio feature, a couple days. And I think I'm working on breaking news. And then by like the end of the first day, there's some new story. I mean, so this week it was the announcement that, Tom Homan had been talking about bringing hell to Boston. And indeed, they made over 300 arrests. So that interrupted my story. And then there was the Turkish student who, made national news for getting arrested by ICE. It's just constant. So I think there's a term for this. Steve Bannon calls it flooding the zone. So it's kind of a propaganda tactic, perhaps. But how do you triage this stuff? I mean, I'm asking myself this question now as a reporter. How do you decide when to jump off the story that you're working? How do you handle this?
I feel like you can't respond to everything. Isn't that I feel like that is the point, right? To exhaust you to the point where you get to a moment in time where you say, oh well.
You give up.
Right. I can't, I'm overwhelmed. I can't focus on the thing that I really need to focus on. So I think at a certain point, we have to say, hold on, is this a shiny red object? Or is this a specific threat that we actually need to engage with, to organize around, and to fight?
I mean, I think it's really hard. I mean, I'm personally exhausted, just from covering the news, but also from absorbing it. I mean, it's just they're trying to overwhelm people, and they're succeeding. So I mean, I think there's a couple different ways in which I think about it. One is, I'm also trying to keep attention focused on the threats to journalistic independence and press freedom, because I think it's so important. And that's really hard to do when there's outrage after outrage, when, I see the arrest of the Turkish student and I'm just in shock and horrified, and my mind turns away from this task that I think is so critical. I think we're all experiencing that. So you have to make tough decisions, but you also have to believe. And I hope I'm right about this. That this is a deliberate strategy, and it can't be sustained. This cannot. It just they have to punch themselves out at some point, and the pace has to slow, because it's a deliberate strategy to overwhelm us and as citizens, but as journalists as well. So I think I agree with Ashanti. You have to recognize and understand what's happening. You have to do your best to pick the stories that you think are most critical, and you have to anticipate that this pace is unsustainable, and at some point it'll slow, and maybe we'll be able to focus our attention on the issues that truly matter.
Well, I feel like we're just getting started, but they're asking me to wrap up. I want to ask one more question, if we could do like a lightning round type thing. The pushback, our role in so far as we're the bulwarks of everything that's happening now. What can journalists do to defend our work at this time? Let's start with this guy.
I mean, we keep going back to Mitch, but I think you said it when you kicked off the conference, and I'm going to paraphrase, but you just said something like, we have to keep doing the work, right? What is the work? The work is telling the truth. The work is getting the story out there. And to Joel's point and Ashanti's point, yeah, it's overwhelming. Like, we're all fucking tired, right? But you got to keep your eye on the prize. And I think, yeah, there's going to be days where it's going to feel impossible and you're pushing the boulder up the hill. But if we can keep telling stories, whether they're local in their unrepresented communities or whether they're big, and we can hold people accountable for the truth, if we can just kind of keep focusing on the truth day in, day out, we'll keep chipping away at it. I have to believe that, right?
It's like Bill Belichick said, do your job.
Exactly.
I would say yes, we have to keep doing the work, but I also think we have to take time to take care of ourselves, right? I think that it is important, especially now more than ever, to be able to take time out to find joy, to be able to take time out to spend with your family and your friends, to be able to take time out to say, what is it that I need to refill my cup so that I can keep doing this work? Because if you are depleted, if you are burnt out, the work doesn't matter, right? So you have to find ways to protect your peace through the work, or there is no work to be done, because your body will find a way to sit your butt down.
Well, that is so wise and so necessary. And just to keep things simple, I'm going to repeat my message because it's the message I'm delivering whenever I have the opportunity. As you know, journalists and news organizations, our job right now is to defend our rights and defend them fiercely, to protect our people. We saw what can happen if you don't do that, and to report the news with independence. I don't think we have to make it overly complicated. There will be other opportunities to talk about the tactics, but that is our job. That is our job, and we have to stay focused on it.
Well, Joel, Ashanti, Max, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.